Hi guys, welcome back to another video, or your first video here, I don't know. Welcome if you're new here, welcome either way. So this is going to be my incredibly late June wrap up. I haven't been filming for a couple of months, but I have been tracking what I've been reading and info for a couple of other videos. So today's going to be a heavy filming day and I'll hopefully get a lot of cool videos up for you guys soon. So to go through what I read in June, I've planned out these videos from the books I liked the least through to my favourites of the month. So I'm going to start with books that I started and decided not to finish. The first one of those being Disobedience. So I'll just move over here so I can pop up a picture. So yeah, this book was something that we read for book club and it just didn't work for me. Apparently it's a very famous movie and I had never heard of it. I was interested to give it a go. It is about two women who are trying to reconcile their sexuality with their Jewish faith. And honestly, I just found that the way in which this was written was incredibly dry. I found it really hard to engage with the characters and their decisions and personality, and so that's what I struggled with. I think that the topic was incredibly interesting and I think it probably had some great things to say. It sparked some really interesting discussion in the book club meeting that we had, but yeah, the writing just didn't work for me, so I decided not to continue. My next DNF was It Came From the Closet, which is a collection of short stories all about queerness in horror films and horror movies, either with the subtext or with the villainization or with the representation, etc. Sorry, my dog was being loud. Anyway, so it's a collection of short stories all written by different authors about either a particular horror movie or their experiences with horror as a genre in general, and I picked it up because of the queer representation, but I think that the whole premise of the book works on the assumption that the reader is a huge fan of the horror genre and classical horror movies, and I'm just not, so this one doesn't work for me and I decided to give a pass on it. Next we have Law of the Jack-o'-lantern, and the writing really didn't work for me in this one. Again, it's a collection of short stories. From the cover I actually thought it was a graphic novel. For me, the writing was just far too overdramatic and cheesy. I think that movies that fit into that sort of Halloween style subgenre rather than straight out horror, I think can lean very much on the side of cheesy, and this was just too much, so I decided to give up on that one. The next DNF I have is The King is Dead, and this one I picked up because it was queer. I hadn't heard anything else about it. It had some reviews comparing it to Red, White and Royal Blue, and I don't think this is like a permanent DNF, but I think I just wasn't in the right mood for it. And I should have guessed this because of the cover, but I thought it was going to be slightly more serious and it ended up being far more dramatic than I wanted at the time. So this might be something to look into if you're in the mood for something about young people and royalty and relationships with queerness and drama, but just it wasn't what I was in the mood for at the time. And the last DNF I have from this month was The Last Son. So again, I picked this up because I heard it was queer. I think I got it in a sale that was happening on Audible. And for this one, I thought the writing was good, but I really didn't like the main character. I thought he was a real asshole. And I think it's the sort of book that relies on you sort of rooting for that main character, and I just knew I wasn't going to based on the way he was behaving, so yeah, not for me. So now on to books that I actually did finish, and so I have two comics here that I got at MCM Comic Con, and that is Fatcraft Volume 2 and Volume 3. So these are zines that were created by contacting a bunch of different artists who wanted to create anthologies of artwork where the focus was on, in this one, fantasy, and in this one sort of more mythology, where the main characters of these artworks were fat people and large people, and to sort of be there for representation. Now, some of the artworks in here I thought were, oh, there's some information on the artists inside, but some of the artwork in here I think was really gorgeous, and some of it just didn't work for me. Same with this one, so that's why I gave them 3 stars. I really appreciate what books like this are doing for representation, however, these didn't really work for me. Next, I have my only 3.5 star, and that is Be My Love, My Lord. So this one was a gay comic that I found on my Scribd app, and I decided to give it a go. It is about a society where there are humans and half human, half beast creatures, and they're seen as less than and lower than. And it is about a relationship formed between a human and a half beast. And it was sweet. It was about seeing past someone's caste and getting over the discrimination of the society. It was sweet. It was cute. It had that commentary, but I'm never going to think about it again. I'm never going to reread it. It didn't really stick in my mind all that much, so that's why it's at the 3.5 mark. And now we're on to 4 stars, the first of which is a poetry collection I read this month, and that is The Dogs I Have Kissed. So this is an LGBT poetry collection. I can't really give you a plot because a lot of poetry collections don't have a running through plot, but this is a poetry collection I really enjoyed. I connected with it. I would really recommend it if you're into poetry. The next 4 star I have, although I think upon reread it could get a higher rating, is Huang Yong Text, or The Words in Your Snare. And this was a really interesting comic that I read, and I pretty much only picked it up because I heard it was queer. It had been recommended to me on social media relentlessly, so I decided to give it a go, and I was surprised at how serious the plot got and how good it was. I often pick up these comics thinking that they're going to be a good time, but they're not going to sort of hit that hard or be one of my favourites, but this one was really good. So it follows the main character who can, to a certain extent, read people's minds. He can glean thoughts and feelings in the form of seeing those words, and he can interpret that through, say, the words colour, or how to explain it, behaviour. Like, he can see the words floating around, and if they're like darting about and sort of hitting into things versus just like floating around nicely, he can sort of glean things from that, and in doing so has become involved with police investigations because he's seen as someone who can read minds. And so it follows him forming a new relationship with someone, but it also follows him in a nasty police investigation looking at drug users and drug sellers, and the police believe that the man he is getting into a relationship with might be at the heart of this, so he has to navigate these. The plot beats were handled with such care despite tackling really dark topics, and they weren't just written off, they were really interestingly explored. You have parental abuse and parental neglect. You have really complex sibling dynamics between the 2 brothers, both of whom to a certain extent can read minds, but in different ways. You have the inner workings of this mafia style drug users. Like, there were so many topics in here, and I think that everything was handled really well, and I'd be very willing to reread this, and I do think it would climb higher up my rating scale if I did. Next we have another comic, and that is Just Friends. So this is a comic following 2 women who are meeting up and are reminiscing about their time that they met in summer camp, And I, again, sort of went into this thinking it was just going to be a silly comic and that it would be a good time, but it wouldn't sort of lead to anything. But I really did enjoy this. I think that it did a really good job of handling the complexity of relationships, especially when you are starting to realize that you might be queer. And I also think did a really good job of highlighting the complexity of the human experience and how imperfect these characters were. I think that something that this did a really good job of exploring was the idea of cheating and what might lead someone to cheat. And I think that these were both really complex characters and it was really interesting to see their development. Next we have yet again another comic, and that is A Gentle Nobleman's Vacation Recommendation. I think every single time I say that title I get some slight part of it wrong. This would have been volume 3, I believe. So this is a very D&D style fantasy comic. I think that people who are into D&D would enjoy this. It follows a nobleman who is new to this land or area, and he decides to join an adventurers guild, and he teams up with someone and then goes on adventures, but there's a lot of questions about where he came from and his past. And it is labelled as being queer. It's not very overtly so. And also, this very much is a case of I'm having a good time with it, but I don't, at least at the moment, think it's very deep. I also think there's not enough plot per volume to really be able to speak that much on each volume on its own. So as I continue, I think that I'll be able to give a far more cohesive review once I've actually finished all the volumes. Moving on, I have a book called Boys, 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 and this would be volume 5. So this is created by a group of artists and photographers who, I think it's every year, because I know that they're working on their next volume, or at least have published it very recently. It's a collection of the work from queer photographers, and there's some interviews and other information within this. I saw this in my university's library and decided to give it a go, and I thought it was a really interesting collection, and I think it's wonderful that we see more of this representation in all versions of the arts. Now, this next one, I do not know whether or not YouTube is going to have a issue with this. So if it is, I will bleep out the title, but that is And Their Friends Between Revolutions. So this was such an interesting book. I sort of picked it up on a whim and didn't realise how much of a quintessential piece of queer history this was. So this is a book about several characters. They have quite ridiculous names from what I remember. I think Hollyhock was one of them, and it's all a metaphor for queer family, but also about the fight for equal rights and the ways in which society either allows for equal rights to be a thing, say for example when there's infighting between themselves. And it was such an interesting collection of things. I think that it was built to be something where a queer person would be able to really see themselves and see their friendship dynamics within the friendship that was going on throughout the text. Also, it was such an interesting commentary on rights and the fight for rights. I think that regardless of whether or not you are queer, I think that this would be a really interesting read regardless, just to see the commentary on it. So I would highly recommend. And finally, I have another poetry collection, and that is Plenty Fish by Sarah James. I picked it, oh, I have some pen marks on my hand. So this was one I picked up while in Waterstones, and I really, really enjoyed this. I thought that the poetry was very moving. Again, I can't really say much in terms of the through plot, as it is a anthology of poetry, but if poetry is your thing, this I found really impactful and I would highly recommend. So in my 4.5 stars, I have The Darkest Part of the Forest by Holly Black. So this one I've been meaning to read for ages, since before I read The Cruel Prince. because I think this came out before then, but I just really loved the character work in here. So in this book, we are following a town where there is connection to Fae and the fairies. So all the people in the town are aware that there are changelings and other things that happen as a result of fairy interference. And there is a boy in a glass coffin who is sort of seen as like a local celebrity, and we are following two siblings who are growing up in this town and are sort of monster fighters and have far more of a relevance to what is going on than I think a lot of the adults in their lives really take the time to know. And I thought that there was so many interesting dynamics. You have the interactions between the children and the boy in the glass coffin. You have the parents' interactions with both the Fae and with their children, and the underestimation of either the capabilities of their children, but also the degree to which they are involved in these situations, and the overlooking of a lot of these as just like silly fantasy things. For me, I thought this was a really great read. I really enjoyed myself, but definitely the characters are what really stand out about this. And finally, we have some 5 stars, starting with Queer Little Nightmares. So this is an anthology of short stories all about horror, fantasy, weirdness and queerness, and I just thought it was just one of the best anthologies I've ever read. I really loved a lot of these. Many of them were drawing on a lot of different cultures from around the world and also had a lot of commentary. I think that one of my personal favourites was talking about a woman and about menstruation, and the way that story went was just, it was so interesting how much of these stories evoked such feelings of either squeamishness or just made commentary on how other people see something other as monstrous. And it wasn't about the horror, it was about, well, it wasn't about the horror of the character, it was about the horror of someone having to exist in a world that views them as monstrous for just being. And I just really loved it. I would highly recommend. Next we have something that I know I've reread since. I'm not sure if this would have been a reread in back in June. I think it must have been. But I reread Kill the Farm Boy. So this I've just found as a real comfort read over the past couple of months. This is one of these books that is a fantasy book that pokes fun at fantasy tropes. So we have a farm boy who is designated the chosen one by a fairy and goes off on an adventure. We're also following a bard and a fighter and a rogue and a wizard, and very early on in the story, the farm boy gets into an accident and therefore the other characters have to take up the mantle to try and fix the situation. And I think that a lot of these books in this sort of genre are not like masterpieces. They're not, they're purely there for the entertainment value, but I actually found this one very well written, incredibly humorous, which I don't think a lot of books pull off in. I guess humour is something that is very difficult to pull off given the variety of people's senses of humour. This one just really works for me. I also just love the characters and their interactions. We do have a queer romance through this between 2 of the characters. For now, I won't say who, just in case you want to go into it not knowing who's going to end up in a romantic relationship, but that romance in no way takes away from the rest of the plot. And I also think that we follow each of the characters individually enough that I found the entire read incredibly well balanced. Everyone was very distinct and also someone that I was very interested to follow. And finally, we have A Court of Mist and Fury. So this is the second book in the ACOTAR series by Sarah J. Maas, and I just loved this. I was quite worried about heading into the second book, given the fact that most hardcore fans of this now quite wide-spanning series, it started off being a trilogy, often will say that the first book is trash. They don't reread the first book when they go into further books in the series, and that sort of like the real plot starts in book 2. And when I read book 1, I really, really loved it. I was incredibly hooked. I remember just wanting to get back to the book when, you know, things were happening in real life, and I was like, I really want to know what happens. And so when I started seeing the makings of a love triangle start to happen, I got really nervous about that, because historically I am not a fan of love triangles, or at least I think that they have been overdone, especially in young adult books, although I know these have been aged up, I think quite rightly. I think that they definitely should not have been classed as young adult. However, I think that the love triangle trope in a lot of young adult books was the same dynamic and very predictable in how it was going to work out. You have one girl, two guys, one whom she's known forever and who is a childhood best friend who is in love with her, and another sort of dark, mysterious person that comes into the picture, and they start a relationship, and the childhood best friend gets jealous. And it just works out that it often works out in those scenarios that she never saw the childhood best friend as anything other than a friend, and is always going to end up with this new interesting person. And so I was incredibly worried as to how this was going to work out. However, I think it did such a good job of presenting how her feelings towards these two characters in this love triangle would change over time. And I think that the relationship was so incredibly respectful in this second book. I was so impressed and amazed. I think it doesn't go back on what I thought about the characters and the situation in the first book. I think that the ways in which the behaviours of those characters change makes complete sense with who they are as people. And I haven't even explained what this is about. So the first book follows a human girl who is abducted by the Fae, and she has always had to be incredibly hard and provide for her family, and this is sort of a reprieve, but she's still in a lot of danger, and she ends up having to fight for the people around her. So I just think that I would be interested to reread the first book, actually, now that I have read the second, and I see where, again, I'm trying not to spoil anything, but now that I've seen how those dynamics change over time, I think it would be interesting to see what my opinion, or my changed opinion, would be about those initial dynamics from the first book. So I do completely agree. I think that this book is well worth it, and I am really excited to read the rest of the series. And there you have it. Those are my reads for June, and I will get back to you very, very soon with my reads for July. But anyway, I will see you again in my next video. Bye!